Hello, everyone. I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for joining us today for Cold War Spaces. I think this is the 18th talk already. Today, I'd like to welcome our guest, Leonard Schmieding, on the topic of counterculture space, the East German hip-hop scene. I'm really excited to learn about this topic today, and I got a sneak peek of some of the images, which I'm sure you'll enjoy. He's currently the Curator of Education at the Berlin State Museums and is a historian of modern Germany. His area of expertise range from museums and politics of remembering to, as you'll see today, youth, music, and pop culture. He's the author of a monograph and a number of articles on hip-hop in East Germany. Today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation moderated by Joes Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A, so get your questions ready for the Q&A box during that time. And as always, we appreciate everyone's questions, but please keep them short so it will allow time to get to as many as we can. We also have the chat box open, so you can write some messages that aren't necessarily questions in the chat box. Please remember to switch the blue button there to all panelists and attendees, because otherwise they'll just go to me. And as we're getting started, feel free to say hi in the chat. It's always nice to see where people are tuning in from. So if you want to say hi, as well as the city you're tuning in from. And another technical note, we'll be showing some images, and you can actually change the sidebar to minimize it or hide it or move it so it's not blocking those images. And we'll be posting the recording of today's program on our Vimeo, so if you want to go back and watch it or share it with someone who wasn't able to make it today, you can go back and also view our previous programs in the series. Lastly, I'd also like to thank Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And I'll hand it off to you now to get us started with the interview.
Thank you very much, Anna Rose. Hip-hop is usually associated with American inner-city counterculture. It has its origins among African-American and Puerto Rican teenagers in the Bronx, in New York. But one of the places you would not immediately associate with hip-hop is the former GDR. Life is full of surprises. Today we are going to talk about hip-hop under state socialism. Why were East German youngsters attracted to hip-hop? And how did they get access to its cultural forms and material culture? What happens if you transplant a cultural expression that has its roots in a specific time and place into a completely different context? And how did the East German authorities and the Stasi, the East German Secret Service, deal with the phenomenon? I'm excited to discuss these questions with the #1 East German hip-hop specialist, Leonard Schmieding. Leo, welcome to Cold War Spaces.
Thank you for having me, Joes. It's good to see you again.
Absolutely. Great to see you emerging from the dark.
Yes.
First of all, how did you first hear about hip-hop in East Germany, and what triggered your interest to research its history and even write a book about it?
Thank you. That's actually one of my favorite questions. So I had just gotten back to Germany and moved to Leipzig after a 2-semester stay in the United States, which I spent at Indiana University in Bloomington. And there I got to meet wonderful spoken word artists and hip hop activists who brought me close to hip hop, who introduced me to all of its like social justice potential and so on and so forth. And I was taken, and they had organized a hip hop awareness festival. And when I went to Leipzig, I said to myself, well, why don't I try to do that too, to try to involve the public into all things hip hop and see what they have to say about it, and also engage with the local hip hop scene. And as soon as I had started that, people came out and said, well, we did that in the GDR. We had breakdance contests, there was graffiti, and we also had some rap gatherings, and we had some fun DJs. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Complete
Tell me more.
surprise at that point.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
So what do you do as a historian when you hear such stories? you go and try to consult like written sources usually, right? So you hit the archive, you hit the museum. So the closest or the most accessible archive that was available to me was the university library, and with all its magazines and press archive of the local and well, national East German press. So I went to look for hip hop or coverage of hip hop events, and I found quite a few. And that was like starting in 1984 all the way to like early 1990. And so that gave me a lot of courage to then go to the Stasi archives, which is a very special kind of archive, holding the files of the secret police, if you will. And that had just, well, not us, but it has, they made a lot of more recent files accessible. And I could not look myself, but they help you look for certain keywords that you're looking for and certain names too. And I had some names, I had some dates, I had some keywords, and my search came back with a few really interesting results of the Stasi looking into hip hop, trying to control it, trying to monitor it, trying to curb it. So that's how I got started.
Right, right. So we will focus in our conversation on East Germany, but first of all, I'm very curious to hear if you know of about any other hip-hop scenes in other East European countries, and including the Soviet Union.
Sure, also a great question. A little bit, I know a little bit through, not through original research, but through looking at the literature and the research that other people have done. There's a great volume out there about the rest of, or well, Western Europe, basically, by my colleague Zina Nitsche, Hip Hop in Europe, which is really great. It's basically, it's an edited volume with a lot of little essays in it, detailing the origins and the spread of hip hop in different countries. I have a little chapter in there too, but it's mainly Western Europe, where the focus is. And then there is this great volume, it's about hip hop at Europe's edges, and that has a lot about Russia / the former Soviet Union, former Yugoslavia, Albania. And it's very interesting to see how hip hop, well, came there or spread there and was picked up by youth. Hip hop is youth culture, and so it's always transported by certain kind of media that make it through the airwaves, and then the usually youth pick it up and appropriate it, do with it what they want. And in some parts of Yugoslavia it was more middle class youth. In other parts, and later in the early 90s, it was more working class youth, and they used different, well, musical traditions of their own countries to make hip hop. And that's what really is fascinating, how hip hop as a global Black culture then becomes appropriated by mostly white people, and how they then make meaning by referring to something that came out of the Bronx. So
right.
Very interesting, yeah.
And actually, of course, cultural appropriation is a very hot item nowadays.
Oh yes,
and
yes.
Objects or words or ideas are transplanted from one context to another, and probably get a completely different meaning in a new context. So can you tell a little bit about that aspect? How did the appropriation work, and what was the difference in meaning in a socialist context for hip hop?
Yeah, well, so I think, so I conducted many oral history interviews with former b-boys, graffiti artists, DJs, and rappers. Those are the four elements, like classic elements of hip hop culture. And most of them told me that hip hop for them gave them a sense or the feeling of personal freedom, that they could do finally what they wanted in even in public space that was so controlled and so subjected to like party rule. And finally, and even youth culture, everything was organized to the utmost extent. And here they found something that maybe the adult world didn't understand enough, so that they could actually create the meaning that they wanted and not be controlled by any adult authority. And they told me that that kind of personal freedom was very important to them, and that what connected them to hip hop in New York City, and sometimes they use the word Bronx, was that they also felt like they were living in the ghetto, which is of course a very problematic term and a very problematic parallel, but that's what they thought. So not being able to break out of the GDR, which you couldn't, right? Mm-hmm. Except you went east, but then it was highly controlled too. You can go west.
Case was not a part of an inner city, but it was the whole
right.
country.
The whole country, yes.
I see.
And you couldn't get out, but hip hop was the way out, at least on an imaginary and emotional level. And this is also what kind of brought the scene together. A scene is something that is constituted by a whole number of people, a mass of people who make meaning with the same kind of material objects in youth culture, with the same kind of consumption practices of music, of paraphernalia. And they quickly became very mobile and visited each other and created all kinds of events and followed each other to where they went. So it was a very lively scene, although small, I have to say.
Yeah, and speaking about material culture, I mean, there are all these things you need in order to express yourself as a hip hopper. Think of tapes and boom boxes and fashion, sneakers, spray cans, you name it. How did they get hold of these things?
Well, there are two steps, right? First of all, you have to kind of know or learn how this culture works, right? So at first they only had little sound snippets from Western radio stations, or little short video clips that they saw on, again, Western TV programs of dancing, of breakdancing. So, and of course they couldn't buy any of the Puma or Adidas or Nike sweaters or shoes or t-shirts. So they just danced with what they had, right? The shoes that they had, and then the sports kind of tracksuits that they had. And then slowly they kind of improvised and created their own outfits. I have a couple that I would like to show you in a little bit, pictures of. And then there was Beat Street, the movie that was imported. We can talk about that in a little bit.
Sure.
That is a very important kind of break, or it was a pivotal moment in the development of and evolution of hip hop in the GDR, where they learned how hip hop really functioned and what they needed to do it. And then basically at the same time, the authorities learned that spray cans could also be used for spray painting graffiti. They kind of banned spray cans. So they got them from Czechoslovakia, sometimes from Poland, sometimes from Hungary, where they went. I have different accounts of that. Very, very fascinating. Mm-hmm. But the rest, records, they didn't really have. They couldn't buy any, except if you had grandparents who could sometimes buy them for you if they were allowed to travel west, which was allowed more than for young people. And it was very different from the spread in the West, where you had a direct contact with African-American GIs, who were the main spreaders of hip-hop culture, the main dissemination people, if you will, who had their clubs, who had the knowledge, who had the material objects. And in the West, in the East, you needed to improvise and make everything yourselves, which is, again, sometimes a little bit of an uncanny parallel to how things started out in the Bronx, where people had improvised a lot. The discotheques outside, getting electricity from, well, you know, street lanterns and so on and so
right,
forth.
right, right.
So,
but of course, they
yeah.
developed their own expression, whereas this is based
Right.
on a kind of second-hand information.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm very curious, can you say something about the sociological or even psychological backgrounds of the people, the young people who actually engaged in hip-hop? And I'm also curious whether these were all boys bands or were there girls involved?
Well, they were mainly male, mostly boys, young men, because they practiced what they saw, right? And there was an extremely kind of male or masculine, well, picture of hip hop coming over the Atlantic, with the like main protagonists all being male in African American hip hop culture. So at that time, so that's why girls didn't play a major role. I know of some B-girls, and I know of one rapper, one MC, and there were some like gymnastic groups who you know did cooperations or collaborations with b-boy crews, but they weren't B-girls as you would call them if they were like doing breakdance. Right. Excuse me. So that's very important. And then psychological, I'm not really sure. I'm not a psychologist, but what is interesting is if we look at hip hop culture from a generational point of view, we see that they were all born like between 1965 and 1975, that decade. So they experienced the GDR in its final decade, mostly when they were teens, and at its bleakest, right? The whole kind of golden era of Honecker taking over power in 1971 had waned. There were lots of crises. Consumer culture didn't work as it used to, even under Ulbricht. There were shortages. You had to wait a long time for some material goods that you wanted. And so this generation, if they really had grievances with state socialism, they didn't try to like reform the system like the generation before them, who were born into socialism, right? The 1949er generation. But they kind of distanced themselves from the system. So again, this imaginary breakout from the GDR, this imaginary like travel to New York City, to Manhattan, to the Bronx, was also a way of distancing yourself from Dresden, from Rostock, from Leipzig, from the GDR. Right. Although there were still many instances where, especially in rap lyrics, they talk about their everyday and how they don't like it and how they'd much rather be in the United States. So very interesting.
Yeah. So in that sense, it seems very surprising to me that Harry Belafonte's film Beat Street from 1983 was actually accepted by the East German authorities to be screened in East German movie theaters, where it became immensely popular. Can you explain to us why that was accepted?
Yeah, that's actually one of the pivotal points in the development of hip hop in the East. So there are several aspects to it. One is Harry Belafonte was a well-known figure and an appreciated activist among communists in the GDR. So although they didn't call him civil rights activist, but like peace activists, because civil rights was nothing that you could speak about in the GDR. So a peace activist, and similarly to Paul Robeson or Angela Davis, that was basically the trio that was, when it also comes to music and communism, that was named, and he was among them. And so that was basically a guarantee for quality as they wanted it in the Ministry of Culture. The other aspect is if you can't ban something because it has already spread so far and developed so far, and you will look stupid trying to do it, then you try to explain it and accept it somehow, and explain your acceptance. And that was one of the reasons why they imported Beat Street, so that they could make money off of the ticket sales. They could try to indoctrinate their youth by showing them America as they liked it, which is a bad capitalist, exploitative, racist country, taking advantage of the African American population. And that was what they had in mind. But the youngsters in the GDR, they loved hip hop culture, and they didn't think about politics of the whole thing twice. So that was interesting. So, but with importing that, they imported also a whole kind of, well, tutorial of how to do hip hop, and an explanation of how hip hop works, and that it is actually not bad for socialism. And many people subscribe to that in the media, and it got raving reviews mostly. And well, the spread of hip hop was encouraged, and the practice of hip hop was actually allowed, and it was, of course, put into the cultural bureaucracy of state socialism, but it was not banned, at least not by the cultural authorities. What the Stasi did was, and the police did was, is on a different page. So again, this is basically also a plea to, or a suggestion to see the state socialism not as some kind of a monolithical block that always wanted to suppress or oppress its population, but more the actors sometimes didn't know what the other ones were doing, and there was not like a single red thread or a single policy that was being followed.
But I imagine that the authorities were less than thrilled by hip-hoppers rapping about themselves wanting to live in the United States.
Yeah.
Was that accepted as well?
No, they, first of all, mainly the raps, the rap lyrics, most of them were in English. And if you, I mean, neither the police nor the Stasi officials spoke English well enough to understand that, at least in a live context, in a performative context, right? And my argument would be that, or actually my argument is that there's a lot of, if you have a fan group, if you have a scene, people know what you rap, right? If you're the rapper, if you're the MC, people know what you're talking about.
Right.
If you are the policeman of the Volkspolizei, or if you are the Stasi official going there for only one time, you have no idea what's going on. And they really tried to get people from within the scene to spy for them, but they were not successful in doing so. I know they recruited one person in Stralsund, but that person proved to be not reliable enough, and they didn't have enough of a leverage to make him do what they wanted. So,
right. Would it be fair to say that they let it be as long as there was no direct political criticism involved?
That's fair to say, yes. So it was, on the one hand, the hip hoppers mostly did what they wanted within the framework that was being provided, the political one too, right? They had to, if they wanted to perform in public, they had to get certain licenses. If they wanted to have an event, they needed to work with the authorities. So it was not just that they could do actually what they wanted, but they kind of found their ways into making these events how they wanted them to go down. and they could ascribe meaning to what they did without anybody telling them what they should think or feel. So that's the argument. But at the same time, they didn't endanger or they didn't pose a big threat to the system, I don't think. And it remains to be, or we can still discuss it, whether they, by doing that, actually kind of corroborated the system or like kind of provided some kind of stability because it worked, or whether they did not, because with their hearts and minds were actually halfway out of the GDR and not following events, or weren't really interested in how the GDR developed,
right,
or what happened politically. They were not part of the peaceful revolution, and so on and so forth. They did their own politics, and they created their own communities, and that's what counted for them.
Right. So since hip-hop originated as a cultural expression in the United States from people of color, were the East German hip-hoppers all white, or did they also include people of color there?
That's a really interesting question, and I didn't research that for my book. I think it would be worth a research project, at least for maybe a longer article. So, as many of you might know, the GDR had a black population too, from Mozambique and from Angola and from Cuba too, as so-called contract workers, Vertragsarbeiter, and they came to the and from Namibia too, and they came to the GDR to learn certain trades, to earn money, and then sometimes even to be trained as good socialists, and then to go back to their countries. Again, I'm not a specialist, and some of this might be not entirely correct or very broadly painted in broad strokes. But of course, sometimes they brought their children with them, and those sometimes found their way into breakdance crews. I have some pictures from Dessau, I think mostly Dessau, where they're non-white African from Mozambique or Angola b-boys. But I don't know whether they approached these kids to dance in their crews because they wanted to be black, for the Angolan and Mozambican teens to kind of provide them with more authenticity, which would be very racist to do, or whether they were friends before and then this is how they got together. So those would be interesting questions among many others to find out, but it's very hard to research this, but maybe someone wants to take it up and do it. Yes, I see that our time is almost up. Is there an interest to look at some visual material, or
absolutely? Let us show something, and then in the meantime, while you are showing it, let me ask my final question before we go to the Q&A, and that is: can you tell us very briefly what happened to the East German hip hop scene after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and what you would consider as its enduring legacy?
Yeah. So those are two very good questions. I'm going to talk about each picture in 5 seconds. So this is an official booking, so to say, and you can see that it's in the GDR because on the left-hand side there's Erich Honecker, not sitting, but framed on the wall in the picture in the photograph. Then here we have some street dancing from Boogie Wave in Berlin. Here you have them dancing in a breakdance workshop in Leipzig, which happened once a year. They were very successful. You can see how they made their own tracksuits. And this is in Dresden, or in Radebeul, which is close to Dresden. And in the mid picture in the middle, this is Big Bass Electric Boogie, the TJ, the tape jockey. But there were also real disc jockeys, as you can see on the record player decks. And then on the right upper hand side is actually an MC, a female MC. So in here you have a little bit of some graffiti impressions and a Beat Street, a homemade Beat Street shirt. You can see that they also did some graffiti on cars. And this was actually from a Stasi file, the upper two pictures. All right, I will keep this on while I answer your question, Joes.
Yeah, perfect.
Since hip-hop was mostly also state-sponsored, right? With the state being in the free fall or not being in existence anymore, the whole support system for hip-hop also was no more. So you couldn't get paid anymore. You couldn't, didn't find gigs anymore, and you couldn't even practice anymore anywhere. So maybe you also had something more important to do, right? If you were a 15, 17-year-old kid whose state has just been overthrown, and you needed some orientation. School wasn't like it used to be, your place of work. So everything was new or in transformation. So that's why you maybe had something more important to do than hip hop. But in the mid-1990s, the scene started to, or the people who were really interested and sometimes were also really, successful in dancing or doing graffiti, they came together again and they met with their counterparts in the West, and the scene grew. And the enduring legacy, I would say, is that many of the former, especially breakdance crews, have regular get-togethers, and they come, share their stories, share their albums. They're really interested in, well, talking about their own history and their own youth. And they sometimes play important parts in breakdance competitions as judges or as teachers or as dance instructors. So that's an enduring legacy, I would say.
Right.
And another actually book maybe even would be to look at how the cultural and social reunification after the political happened on the 3rd of October 1990, almost 30 years ago today, then happened in the decades afterward, right? So how did youth cultures, including punk and heavy metal and gothic or dark wave and so on and so forth, and including hip hop, how did they what did they contribute in making the two parts of the country grow together? And I think hip hop played an important part in that. And that would be another book, I guess,
right.
For which the work that has been done by other scholars of youth culture in the GDR could be the basis.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And let's go to the Q&A now.
Most welcome.
Please, everyone, put your questions in the Q&A box. We have one question ready by Bruce Hollihan. He writes, do you see a relationship between the hip-hop of the GDR to the current day hip-hop scene in Germany, popular with Turkish Germans in places like Kreuzberg and Berlin? I would imagine that the African-American influence still to be strong.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not a follower of present-day hip-hop much. But from what I know, and also from what I guess, is that, or I would guess that that basically not the parallelism, but maybe the way that young Turkish German or German of Turkish descent rappers or hip hop fans or practitioners, for example, in Kreuzberg, can relate to hip hop in the Bronx might be similar to what young hip hoppers or rappers, especially in the GDR, did, saying we're being discriminated against in a certain way, and we want to voice this, and hip hop is our way of doing that. But what I should note is that in West Germany, in the 1980s, there was a real kind of, well, not really fraternization, but there was a lot of collaboration between African-American GIs and former GIs, so no longer servicemen, but former GIs who had stayed in the country in West Germany, and Turkish German club owners, especially in Frankfurt, for example, where African American GIs could get entry to. So they could. Other clubs were basically whites only, so very racist practice also in West Germany, and they weren't appreciated there. But in the Turkish-run clubs, no problem. So that might be an interesting comparison there.
Right, sure. Next question is by Nathaniel Hansen. He asks, where can we listen to some of the Gdr hip-hop you are discussing?
Very good. So none of these were official productions. So they're all in private collections. There are tapes that they made themselves and sometimes or shared with me, who did the research, and shared also with Nico Raschig, the documentary filmmaker. And if you really want to listen to anything, you could, you could get my book or get his film, and then from the names, do a Google search or a YouTube search, and sometimes they put some stuff on there. But Nico Raschig's documentary film Here We Come has a really good extra material, bonus material section, and there's a lot of visual and also sound material.
I see.
However, I should say there was one official Amiga production that the Wende Museum should have.
Amiga being the official record company in East Germany.
Exactly. Amiga was one of the, I think 2 or 3 labels, that state-run labels that existed in East Germany, and maybe the Wende Museum has it. If not, they should maybe get it. It's by the Electric Beat Crew, and it was produced in a closet in, I think, the keyboarder's home apartment, and then sent to Amiga via some kind of a soundtrack studio. So it was not Amiga, but it was produced for television. So that was that, and I think the album is also just called Electric Beat Crew. And then there's a lot of material in official archives too, because it ran on official East German radio, DT64, DT64, the youth radio.
Yeah.
So, but for that you would need to have access to the archive. But I'm trying to get some permissions to put it on a web page that accompanies my book.
Right.
So maybe then. And then lastly, there was one there were efforts to produce socialist hip-hop, which wasn't produced by the teenagers, but it was produced by pop stars or composers who were basically commissioned to do something. And that was Arnold Fritzsche, and he had a pop project in 86 or 85 that came out of the youth culture conventions that happen in Suhl in Thuringia every year.
I'm going to interrupt you if you don't mind, because we have a whole bunch of other questions and only a few
go ahead.
So I'm also going to ask you to keep your replies very short. One is here: what was the state's response to graffiti culture in the GDR? Was it viewed as criminal vandalism?
Yes, it was. Mostly it was. The 2 pictures I showed came straight out of the Stasi files in Dresden, so they tried to find the people who did that. It was vandalism, but at the same time, some of the graffiti artists actually were commissioned to paint or spray paint pictures on some public walls too. So you had both. And then there's a very funny incident in Rostock that you can read all about in one of the German Historical Institute's bulletin supplements that Joes himself edited, and will be happy to provide information about.
Perfect, thank you. Marco Gable writes, is it weird that breakdancers were hired for Communist Party guys and became kind of mainstream while others try to keep distance to the system? Do you know anything about the split of the movement those days?
I know that there were discussions and fights, and I don't know whether there was an actual rift, but some people even rapped, "We are not commercial," which meant that we don't want to play by the rules, by the state's rules. Mm-hmm. But some were happy that they had a license and could be booked, but still dance on the streets. That's the ambivalence about it, or of it. And others said, I don't want to have a license. I'm just going to dance in private or try not to get caught. So,
right. Okay. Geneva Rangel asks, can you explain a little more of ways the hip hop scene was state sponsored in the GDR?
In more ways. Well, it was sponsored. So for example, every breakdance crew, you couldn't just exist without any official sponsorship by either some FDJ, Free German Youth secretary saying you can do this, you can even practice in our gymnasium, or a Betrieb, which is a company doing that for you. And you always had to have some kind of an official stamp for anything that you wanted to do. But the state and the cities, the city cultural cabinets, they were very happy to give that to you because they thought that you were actually contributing to socialist culture and socialist entertainment culture. Right. And with that stamp, sometimes you could undermine their original kind of policy.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to combine two questions and maybe you can take them together in your answer by Wende Schmieding and Esther Elliott. Mm-hmm. Wende writes, were there specific topics, focuses in the lyrics, political, battle, representation, comedic, etc., or was it similar to the US rap? And Esther asks, did the German youth speak English to understand the songs? Most of Warsaw Pact countries had to learn Russian as a foreign language and didn't have any or only a few English teachers.
Yeah, no, good questions. So TJ Bigwasser Electric Boogie in Dresden, for example, was very keen on learning English, and he even befriended two, interestingly, British English language instructors at the Technical University in Dresden, who, of course, first of all, were white, and second of all, didn't have any clue about hip-hop, and third, probably didn't speak the American variety of English. So caution, right? But then he tried to get as many covers of the vinyls where he could then read the lyrics and learn. So that's how we did it. And this is actually how many people first learned the English they needed for their hip-hop practice, for their rap practice. And TJ Bigwasser, like Boogie, was very keen on being original. So using, just copying some lines was not okay, but using the English you learned by listening to hip-hop and by maybe reading the lyrics was of course okay. And then so that leads me to the first question, which is what were the topics? And you found both. You found basically 1-to-1 copies of let's have a party and let's clap our hands and I'm gonna rap till the break of dawn. So you have that one-to-one, not very original, not very creative kind of, I'm a rapper too, but then you also have, I'm not happy with how the system limits me, or
Right.
The mayor of Dresden should not call the shots. I should call the shots. Well, you find the boasting, you find the dissing, you find battle raps, you find all that. You find a lot of evocation of history. So Big Buster, like a Boogie, compares it, like his sound with bombers who bombed Dresden in 1944. So it's like, it's very, he was a more intellectual guy, like thinking maybe a little bit more. Other lyrics I haven't had access to, so I just had to listen to. And I would say, and then they are hard to understand because of the sound quality also. But as I said earlier, I think their English was good enough to listen to hip hop and understand it if they were part of the scene, and then could also talk to the people or talk to the performers and about their practice.
And on that note, Grit Coach sends a message: I am from the Beat Street generation of the East, and I affirm that Beat Street was more meaningful to us than people might think, and we spoke English! Exclamation marks. So I want to conclude with a final question or remark, and I apologize for the fact that we are not able again to answer all questions because of the time. This is by Susanna Altman, and she writes, having been among those who inhaled Beat Street at age 19, I wonder whether you have any research sources about why the officials admitted that movie in. Because these years there were so many different films from the West publicly presented, be it by Milos Forman or Carlos Saura, the band, or of more political authors, that the showing of Beat Street didn't seem exceptional at the time, just as a means to prevent more young people to not file for immigration. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so with the remaining time, probably not very extensively, but I have several essays where I explain that with also using the sources. So you can just do a simple search and then you'll find it, I guess. But there was the Hauptverwaltungsfilm, so the people who did all the import of the movie. They basically said that the movie shows how it was a so-called problem film, which showed a problem, and the problem arose out of the capitalist system of the USA, which wanted to be showcased, and in order to educate the own youth about the bad USA. So that was one. And the other one was that they knew it was going to sell a lot of tickets, and with that, it was a so-called Millionenfilm, a blockbuster, and they indeed sold 3 million tickets, which was quite a few. And Beat Street ran for several years. It would still be available in 1989. So with 3 million tickets sold, you could feed that money into the socialist film production, and that was one major reason too. So you had these were two of the major aspects. And I have the source material. Yes, it's in the Bundesarchiv, in the Federal Archives, and I quote from that extensively in the essays. So sorry not to be more elaborating here, but I think the time doesn't permit us to go into detail.
No, exactly. We have to stop here. And Leo, I want to thank you very, very much for highlighting this very original topic. And it was wonderful to have you in the series. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, you're most welcome. Thank you for having me. If anybody wants to ask more questions, and if you want to relay them to me, I can try to answer them in the coming weeks. And then be safe, everybody out there, be safe. And I hope you enjoyed this. see you next time.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Next week, our guest is Tony Shaw, Professor of History at the University of Hertfordshire. And with him, I will speak about celluloid space, Hollywood's Cold War. It will be interesting too. So I wish you a wonderful week and hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.